Eminent writer and philosopher, Professor Sir Roger Scruton, has for over 3 decades taught at institutions on both sides of the Atlantic, including Birkbeck College, Boston University, and more recently, the University of Buckingham. He is an author of over 40 books. In his work as a philosopher, he has specialized in aesthetics, with particular attention to music and architecture. He has written several works of fiction, as well as memoirs and essays on topics of general interest. He engages in contemporary political and cultural debates from the standpoint of a conservative thinker, and is well known as a powerful polemicist. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and the British Academy. He has been officially honored by the Czech Republic, by the city of Plzeň, I hope that's close, and by Virginia's General Assembly. In 2004, he received the Ingersoll Weaver Prize for Scholarly Letters. In 2015, he published 3 books, all of which were chosen among the People's Books of the Year. In 2016, he was recipient of the Polish Lech Kaczynski Foundation's Medal of Courage and Integrity, was awarded the Italian Massi Prize for the culture of wine in recognition of his book, I Drink, Therefore I Am, and was knighted in that year in the Queen's Birthday Honor List. We're glad to have with us Professor Roger Scruton.
Well, as you heard, that was on the verge of becoming a list of my sins. I realize that in this place, I've got to be on my very best behavior. So I shall begin by thanking the Wheatley Institution, and Richard Williams especially, for inviting me, and for thinking about this important question. Let me see if I can make this work. The question of what these 3 great concepts really embrace and what they have to do with each other. Richard Williams got in touch with me saying, look, you're an expert on aesthetics, and we here in the Church of Latter-day Saints, we believe in the beautiful, the good and the true, but we don't know how to say what we believe. And you have been working all your life on this, so you should come and tell us. All I can say at this point is that perhaps because I've been working all my life on this, I don't know how to say anything about it. Always I come back to questions. And the only benefit of having thought about these questions for so long is that there is a certain clarity in asking them, but no further clarity in answering them. Now that shouldn't depress you, because in a true philosophical approach to things, it is the clarity of the question in the end that really matters, because that enables you to fit the subject matter into your own life and make the decisions that you have to make about it. Now, so let me say a few things about art and truth, first of all. The Enlightenment, by which I mean that mass of thinking and idea-mongering that began in the beginning of the 17th century and went on through to the beginning of the 19th. That period in our intellectual history brought with it, as I'm sure you know, a certain loss of the religious anchor in everyday life. Maybe in this part of the world that loss was not felt so much. Of course, there was nobody living in this part of the world just then, but there was your ancestors lost somewhere on the way to this place, who did probably feel a residue of this great movement of ideas that began in Europe, and recognized that the scientific worldview, which had come to the fore with Newton, was posing a certain threat to the more naive of one's religious beliefs. And among educated people, especially in France and Britain, and in Germany too, there was an attempt to find a rival source of meaning to the religious, to find that rival source of meaning in art. Because for various reasons, art struck people as having a different status from science. Science was a threat to religion. That's true, because it was undermining the old explanation of things in which God took such an important place. But art seemed to represent a different way of looking at the world from science, one which, as it were, preserved the mystery of things and didn't undo the mystery. And since the mystery was so important, why not look to art as a source of meaning? So art suddenly became prominent as a human enterprise, and with it, the birth of the subject of aesthetics. Aesthetics being the philosophy of art and the philosophy of beauty. And now there's three important figures I mentioned there: Shaftesbury, Baumgarten, and Kant. Shaftesbury was an English philosopher, 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, who was a pupil of John Locke, who wrote very influential essays about the role of the beautiful in the formation of the human spirit. He was an educationist and somebody who felt that it was his duty to draw the attention of his contemporaries to the complexity of human life and to the consolations that we find in human life. And beauty is one of them. He was very influential, though his theories are somewhat all over the place. Baumgarten was the person who invented the word aesthetics as the name for a discipline. He wrote a book called Aesthetica, which was about the art of poetry. Aesthetica, aesthesis is the original word. It's a Greek word, as I'm sure many of you know, for feeling. We have it in our word anesthetic. And the burden of his book, Aesthetica, was that poetry communicates truths about our condition, but communicates them not through abstract thought, but through concrete feeling. And that therefore it's a different kind of truth, and it has a different role in our lives and a different value for us. So he began the whole enterprise of distinguishing the artistic way of looking at the world from the literal-minded and possibly scientific way. And Kant, who was much influenced by Baumgarten, took this up and wrote the first systematic work of aesthetics. So these great thinkers raised the question, what do we learn from art? And is what we learn from art a kind of truth, a truth that we perhaps couldn't learn from any other human activity? Well, for a start, art is not one kind of thing. There is abstract art and representational art. Abstract art is like music or like abstract painting, abstract sculpture. It doesn't actually have a subject matter. That's the whole point of it. You're supposed to appreciate it for what it is in itself, for the harmony of lines and figures, for the ways in which things balance against each other. It's supposed to attract attention purely for its own sake and not for the subject matter that it represents. Right, so already that makes it rather difficult to say exactly what it is that we learn from art. And then, of course, what about fictions? The realm of art includes things like novels, plays, films, poetry, all of which are about the world in some way, but they don't give you literal truths about the world. They are about fictional worlds. And it requires an effort of the imagination both to create a fiction and also to appreciate it. When you read a great novel like, say, Jane Austen's Emma, it's not in order to find out about some person called Emma Woodhouse. You know there is no such person. But you do know, nevertheless, that in the creation of this fiction, Jane Austen has put some part of herself and some part of her deep observations of the human condition. But they aren't literal truths about a particular person's life. So what kind of truth are they? Or is there another kind of truth? So that's one of the problems that we encounter in this area. Then there is the problem of the role of experience. If you read a poem to yourself or recite a poem, you know that what matters is the sound of that poem, the structure of it, the way the verse unfolds, the form of it, but not what it literally says, or at least not what it literally says when extracted from that form. It is not like a textbook. If you were curious about nuclear physics, you might pick up a textbook of nuclear physics, read it, and having absorbed it, and being diligent students, memorize the whole lot, you put it on the shelf, and that's it. That's the last time you look at it, because you've extracted the information from it. But that's not the way that people appreciate poems, is it? It's not that they extract the information and then never visit it again. On the contrary, a good poem is one that gains from repetition, even when you know it by heart, and even when it says something that seems extremely light, even if it touches with a light touch the realities of this world. Like, say, Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods. You know, it doesn't say very much, but the form, the rhythm, and the way in which it seems to touch something deep in you mean that you will want to repeat it, want to go on reading it again and again. So one thought then is that we don't actually go to art for information. The information content is not the primary thing, it's the experience. But of course, anyway, not all truth is information. We have lots of different ideas of truth. Christ said famously, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." He didn't mean truth in the sense that scientists use that word, that he is somehow a true representation of the world. He meant something deeper. He meant that you can trust in me, and that by trusting in me, you come to know something about yourself, how far you can go in whatever direction, and with what kind of hope. So that use of the idea of truth, which brings in a notion of trust, perhaps is a more important one for considering art, because we find support in the person we trust. And it's like that with art as well. You know, in many works of art, we feel that we're in the presence of a genuine spirit. Many people feel this, of course, about the works of Beethoven, who described his Missa Solemnis in the preface as from the heart to the heart. What he meant was that this was an utter, sincere outpouring of what he felt, and he expected the audience to engage with it in the same spirit, as though trusting in him to be the guardian of their emotions for the hour-long experience that he was offering. So there's that kind of idea of truth is a very different one from the scientific one, but it still seems to be an idea of truth. Now, this brings up the topic of desire and pleasure, huge topic. Now, I have to say that I'm talking here as a professional philosopher. I know many people in this audience are studying other subjects, are simply curious about the intellectual world, and are not used to thinking in this abstract philosophical way. So I apologize, but just hope that I will inspire you to go on and pursue the matter further. So there is a connection between desiring something and feeling pleasure on obtaining it. If you really want a glass of water, then of course on obtaining that glass and drinking you feel pleasure, the pleasure of satisfying a desire. But it's not a simple connection, because we know that many things that we desire don't give us pleasure when we obtain them. And this is one of the most important parts of moral education, to recognize the difference between those things that you desire, which will bring satisfaction when you obtain them, and those things which you desire, which, when you taste them, you push them away with revulsion. Now, I won't go into that, but of course you might think that maybe art has something to do with that too. Maybe it can teach us in advance about the things which we won't enjoy when we possess them. Well, there are many kinds of pleasure. There's pure sensual pleasure, like you sink into a hot bath at the end of the day. This is a pleasure of the senses as the warmth spreads through your body. It doesn't tell you anything about the world. It's not based on any kind of thinking. But it's the kind of pleasure that animals have. But we also have intellectual pleasures, pleasures which come from thinking things. The pleasure of reading a book is not a sensory pleasure at all, is it? It's a pleasure of the mind, the pleasure of following an argument, of playing with words, and so on. And then there's what I call intentional pleasures. The word intentional means directed outwards onto the world. Like the pleasure you take in somebody's giving you a present. The pleasure you take when you go to see your child take part in the 100-meter race or in the long jump or whatever, and you see in the playing field there he's done it. He's got the first prize. That's a pleasure about something. And when you have a pleasure about something, that means you can make a mistake as well. The race was at the other end of the field, and it looked exactly as though your son had won it. Only later do you discover it was someone else, a lookalike. So was your pleasure real or not? In a sense, it was real, but it was also a mistake. So there's mistaken pleasures, and that's a very interesting fact. So pleasures can be at. I could take pleasure at the beautiful scene out of the window. I can take pleasure about the triumph of my son in the long jump and so on. Now, aesthetic pleasure is of the first kind. It's pleasure at something. It's not like pleasures of taste. When you eat a strawberry ice cream and take pleasure in it, that's a pleasant taste in the mouth. When you look at a profound picture and are moved by it, that's not a pleasant feeling anywhere in you, is it? It's not a sensation of pleasure. You're pleased at this thing that you're looking at, and pleased by it. Maybe pleased about what it's saying, and so on. But it's completely different from a sensory pleasure. That's a great question, therefore, of what is the relation between tastes in food and drink and tastes in music and painting. They're not the same kind of thing at all. You like strawberries and I like blueberries. Fine. There's no real disagreement between us, just different tastes. But you like Beethoven and I like heavy metal. This is a bit more like a disagreement, especially if you then go on to say, that you're liking heavy metal is a sign of the degeneracy of your soul. And the argument can begin then. It may not be possible to resolve it, but the fact is, when in matters of artistic and aesthetic judgment, we do argue, and the arguments are very important to us. Maybe you don't think this about because you're not interested in Beethoven and heavy metal, but there are always going to be areas where you are interested. Suppose you live in a little town which has beautiful houses and beautiful streets, and you're really pleased with it. Your neighborhood is charming and somehow consoling because of its orderliness, and someone builds a huge skyscraper in the middle, or puts in a planning application for a big skyscraper in bright orange tiles. You then start getting together with your neighbours to campaign against this. There'll be arguments will be put forward as to who is right and who is wrong. So, and these matter enormously, these arguments, to people. Looking at the architectural mess between Salt Lake City and Provo, I suspect that Americans don't think about this as much as they should. But on the other hand, if you, anybody who's been to Europe will recognize that there people do think about these things and argue about them all the time. And as a result, the tourist, all sensible tourists don't spend their holidays here, but in Europe. Anyway, that's another matter. But so the great question then is, what is the value of this kind of pleasure, the pleasure that we feel in works of art and aesthetic objects? Can it be a vehicle of truth? Well, it's very interesting that we can feel pleasure in works of art, even when the works of art are sad or even tragic. We take pleasure in a sad story because the story, it does something to the sadness. The weepy movie may have enormous appeal, and you may feel it hasn't worked if you hadn't had a bit of a weep during the course of it. The sadness is part of what was promised. It's part of the deal. And yet it can't be real sadness because nobody voluntarily submits himself to that. But it's something like sadness put in a frame. And the story puts it in a frame and makes it such that it doesn't hurt you in the way that, for instance, the death of someone you love would hurt you. And that framing of our emotions seems to be one of the things that works of art do for us, isn't it? That we seem to be able to come to terms with the sadness of human life, partly because we can represent it in ways that make it more meaningful, framed and isolated. So to pleasure, we always say, come again, but to knowledge we say thanks. And, once you've obtained the knowledge, that's it, you've got it. But the pleasure, okay, you've had it once, but you want it again. And especially in the case of works of art, the repeatability of the pleasure is what it's all about. But perhaps sometimes there is repetition, there is knowledge in repetition. So let's just think about that for a moment. I want to say something first, though, about art and virtue. And moving on now from truth to goodness. What is the moral value of art? What kind of moral improvement can art generate in us? Has it got a particular role in presenting the moral world and in improving our own engagement in it? Well, obviously art is a source of moral examples, but the work of art does not merely present the example. There's lots of examples which are you can sketch for yourself as to how of good behavior and bad behavior. It puts us in a position of judgment. I mentioned there Henry James's portrait of Isabel Archer, which I'm hoping that you young people will be about to read if you haven't read it yet, in Portrait of a Lady, in which Henry James presents to us a good woman who is also naive and exploited by a cunning and evil man, and he doesn't judge himself, but he puts us in a position to make a judgment, and to make the judgment through her eyes. The reader gradually comes to understand her situation as she comes to understand it. Now that's real art. He never says anything, the writer, Henry James. He makes you think it, but think it for yourself. And that might have a special moral value, mightn't it? Rather than just telling you what to think morally, making you think it for yourself. So, as it were, it's a course of education in the emotions that is directed at you. Well, that all looks quite plausible for fiction and for representational art. But what about abstract art? People think that abstract art which doesn't have a representational content, can also have some kind of moral value. That's what Beethoven was saying about his Missa Solemnis, what many people say about music generally, that but it is telling us something about our emotions by leading us to feel at second hand, so to speak, what those emotions are. There's a kind of emotional education going on there too. But then there are real problems, and this is one that Richard Williams wanted me to talk about, and it's a very difficult one to talk about. What happens when you encounter a work of art that presents vice, really vicious behavior, but aesthetically, in such a way as to make the vice attractive? And I take the example here of Salome. Here is the problem, as you remember, of Salome, the story of the daughter of Herodias who danced before the king, or well, did she or didn't she? But anyway, she coveted the head of John the Baptist, perhaps because her mother had put her up to it, and finally persuaded the king to give it to her. In other words, to kill the prophet whom he had been reluctant to do up to that moment because of his manifest holiness. Well, this was made into a play by Oscar Wilde, a rather clever play, and then that was set to music by Richard Strauss. And his music is full of a kind of distraught lasciviousness, but it's very beautiful and seductive. I won't play it to you. I'll leave it to you to encounter it. It's all over YouTube, of course. And this music kind of brings you to Salome's side. You feel that somehow she's in the grip of an emotion that she can't deal with. She's got to satisfy it. But as represented by Strauss and Oscar Wilde, Salome goes the whole hog and takes hold of the head and kisses it. And here's the kind of thing that you see in modern opera productions. Modern opera productions are designed specially to be offensive to members of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. So don't worry, they're usually much worse than this. But here is Salome having sung her incredible aria of sensual ecstasy over the severed head of John the Baptist, seizing it and kissing it in this unacceptable way. Well, most people would feel that's going too far. In fact, people did feel that it was going too far, and this opera did have quite a bit of trouble in its early life, but now it's part of the repertoire. And yet it seems to take a kind of ghoulish pleasure in utterly perverted behavior, and the music seems to put that behavior in a kind of enchanting light, because the music is drawing you in all the time. You find similar things in other works of art of the mid to late 19th century, art that rescues evil by making it seem beautiful. Baudelaire's Fleur du Mal, which I'm sure some of you who are doing French here will be reading and studying, is a very good example of this. He takes the excesses and the degeneracies of life in the modern city and looks for a meaning that lies concealed within them. And he does this through incredibly powerful imagery and beautiful verse forms that make it look as though there is a spiritual meaning behind all this that redeems it. The spiritual is revealed, even though what is described, it denies the possibility of the spiritual. It's as though by denying things in the right way, we can affirm them. And I think that's what Baudelaire himself thought, that often people have described him as a Christian poet precisely for this, that he rescues from the heart of corruption and despair that little germ of spiritual purity which lies in the imagery of his verse, and which we take away and then can, as it were, make to grow within us. Not sure whether that is true, but it's an interesting thought. In Shakespeare, of course, there's a lot of evil, the evil of the character of Iago in Othello, and also Macbeth, who is a self-doubting evil man. But it's straightforward that Shakespeare doesn't expect you to be on their side in any way. He certainly doesn't do a Salome on them, although at a certain point there is a lot of sympathy for Macbeth. And Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost is another very important example of an evil character who is so portrayed by the verse. The verse is so powerful that you cannot fail to be on his side. His wounded pride is something you immediately identify with, and you come to see that there's a kind of nobility about it. And this is what the verse is doing. Is this an immoral verse, therefore, that's bringing you to the side of Satan? Blake, in his illustrations, seems for the Paradise Lost, seems to think that. Right. So there's some other examples I give you there. Claggart, the bosun in Herman Melville's Tale of Billy Budd, another one that you're probably about to read, made into a brilliant opera by Benjamin Britten. And then there's Dmitri in The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. What do we think about him? Is he just confused? Or are we being, again, brought in to the world of a character who is unable to make moral judgments for himself? And aren't we also perhaps confused as to whether we can make those judgments? So one of the questions that arise here is what is the distinction between moral art and moralizing art? Here is a piece of Russian revolutionary art from the 1917 revolution, which is manifestly moralizing. It's telling you that these people are obviously mistreated. So what? Is it saying anything that helps you to understand that mistreatment, or to take a different stance towards it, or is it just like a moral tale, just an illustration to something else? So many people feel that art shouldn't moralize as directly as this. It's too crude. It should be more like Henry James in Portrait of a Lady, making you do the moralizing rather than doing the moralizing itself. Well, that may be so, but let's go on. I want to say a little bit about beauty now. So I've said some things about art's relation to truth, something about its relation to goodness. In both cases, extremely complicated. It seems that there's nothing simple that you can say. What about beauty? There's a certain kind of habit that arose, especially in the late 19th century, connected with people like Oscar Wilde, of putting aesthetic values first, saying that these are the things that matter. Wilde famously said, in matters of the greatest importance, it is style and not sincerity that counts. And he lived his life, or at least pretended to live his life, as though that were his guiding principle, to be elegant and soothing to the eye, but and to ignore all those simple, old-fashioned moral values which got in the way of that. But he didn't, in his works of art, he didn't think that. But to put aesthetic values first is, or might be, a kind of immoralism. Osmond, who is the husband of Isabel Archer in the Portrait of a Lady, is somebody who really does put aesthetic values first. And his delight in collecting beautiful things and living this aesthetic way of life has led him to into great pecuniary need. He needs money, and she has money, so he marries her in order to get hold of that money, and also in order to collect her, because she was beautiful too. So he collects her as a beautiful object, but doesn't love her. Oscar Wilde does a slightly cruder version of the same idea in the character of Lord Henry Wotton in The Picture of Dorian Gray. But there are two sides to the aesthetic experience. There's the kind of relishing side and the exploring side. Relishing a beautiful work of art, a sublime work of music, that's something that you can do without necessarily exploring the depths of the human heart, even though the work of art touches on them. And perhaps this kind of aestheticism means forgetting the cognitive dimension of aesthetic pleasures, that they're not just sensory pleasures, they're not just pleasures in the way you experience things, they're also directed towards a vision of the world. So each of those goals that I've talked about, truth and goodness and beauty, they are important because they are what you're focusing on, but they seem to reduce art itself to an inadequate means. They seem to leave out the aesthetic dimension. So only when combined in a unity, the kind of truth and the kind of goodness of which beauty is the sign, do these values mark out a path for art. That then, if beauty is the way in which truth is presented, the way in which goodness comes to your consciousness, then we seem to have something like an account of the value of art. Well, there's a question here about meaning and form. The meaning of a work of art, and this goes back to Baumgarten, it lies in the form and is not really detachable from it. If you try to translate a poem into straight prose, say what it means, give its equivalent in simple language, then you lose the meaning. So the meaning is not just what it says, it resides also in the form and is not detachable from that. Now, this is a little bit like religion and revealed truth. In much religion, there's a promise of another way of seeing the world, what you might call a God's eye perspective. That it's not just that there are theological doctrines, God exists, Christ is the Son of God, etc. Although those are important to the Christian religion. There is also revealed truth when you meditate on these things and suddenly you see the world in another way as though from God's perspective. And perhaps that, in those circumstances, the form of the language that you're studying, in a sacred text, for instance, is very important, just as it is in poetry. That's why those great texts have been preserved, because they, not just for what they say, but for their way of saying it. And again, in religion too, as in art, repetition is very important. You repeat the service every week. A prayer, like the Lord's Prayer, you say it every day. It's not, if somebody said to you, "What a waste of time," you said it once, why say it again? You know what it means, you know the words, what's all this about? You know that that's not what prayer is for. Prayer is about putting you back into the relation with God that you're constantly slipping out of. And therefore it demands repetition. And there are truths that have to be rehearsed if they are to be owned. To know exactly how to feel something, what to feel towards the world around you. You might feel you know it one moment, but you've lost it the next. And getting the right words helps you to recapture it. So that idea of revealed truth that comes to you through repetition, as in prayer, is a bit like the aesthetic experience as I've been describing it. Perhaps it gives you a secular version of revealed truth. That's what people like Nietzsche and Wagner thought. And they went further and thought that actually art could therefore be a substitute for religion. That's what we really should be now devoting ourselves to. We have art, as Nietzsche says, so as not to die of despair. That our art is still there, giving us this meaning, even when we've lost faith. Now, I won't talk about this, but right, just to finally, some thoughts about the intrinsic values of art. Poetry and plays and paintings, they present imaginary worlds. So representational art gives us an opening onto the world of the imagination. And they all rescue their subject matter from a purely instrumental conception of its significance. Things portrayed in art are not portrayed as useful, they're portrayed as interesting for their own sake. So they're rescued from their instrumentality. And that's why every illusion matters. The image is a distillation of the thing depicted. And poetry and painting work in the same way. Here is a landscape by Van Gogh, which everybody knows probably. That the brush strokes there imbue the landscape with an observing consciousness. They are marks of the moral being for whom this is not a thing, but a vision. To absorb that, you recognize that it's a very long way from the way a field of wheat with a flock of rooks above it would look. But nevertheless, it says restart required. It's referring to me. So, right, I'm restarting. It doesn't look in any way realistic, but somehow it has a power that it wouldn't have if it was wholly realistic, because the brushstrokes of the painter imbue that landscape with his own soul. And it's as though the imagination of the painter had reworked the thing that he's painting, so that it isn't just the thing, it's also that thing distilled into his own consciousness. So in the imagination, we are thinking about absent and non-existent things, but the consciousness involved is a creator of its own object, as in that case of Van Gogh. The imagination is something that we can will. I can ask you to imagine some things. I should say, imagine a field of wheat. You won't be able to imagine it like Van Gogh did, but nevertheless, you will summon it up in obedience to that order. And that is an interesting thing. And through the works of imagination, we bring distant things into close relation with each other. That's what we do in figures of speech in poetry. We're bringing things into relation with each other. And with the brushstrokes in the painting, we're bringing a human action in relation to a landscape. And these imaginary worlds that we create can strike us as true or as false. And I want to contrast that Van Gogh with a painting by Thomas Kincaid. This is one of his visions of paradise. This is a controversial painter, as you know. Van Gogh died in poverty. Kincaid died leaving $53 million and died of drink. And was, I think 1 in 10 American households have a Kincaid above their mantelpiece, because it's a soothing thing that for some people this is a vision of what painting should be. It's much truer to the appearance of things than Van Gogh, but there's a question about it. What is that question? Many people say that there's a falsification behind this kind of painting. I don't want to cast judgment on it, but just to say a few things about it. Why does this strike so many people as false? In one sense, it's truer than the Van Gogh. It's closer to the way things actually look. But the falsification, if it exists, is a falsification of the observer rather than of the observed. It shows a world presented through a veil of self-congratulatory sentiment. That's at least what the critic would say. It tells you that you're a good person and no further efforts need be made. Van Gogh is not telling you that at all. He's telling you that life is rough and you need to make efforts even to see this. So it tells you that no further efforts need be made, and that meaning lies in the forms and the colours, those pastel shades smeared over the landscape like a disease. So, well, is that right? Leave it to you to think. But whatever, this brings us back to the parallel between art and religion. Religion provides us with truth, but it's not just straightforward literal truth about the way the world is. There are stories, all sorts of things that we believe, but there's a much more important dimension to it, a truth, a spiritual truth, and which tells us how things really are. really are for us, and what our position really is in the world of human relations and human emotions. And in religion, we recognize that there's no redemption through falsehood. And the same seems to be true of art. That's what those two pictures, I think, at least lead us to suppose. That art, too, has its own way of presenting the spiritual truth of things. And if it falsifies, then it doesn't produce the kind of redemptive consolation that we're looking for. And this might explain, going back to sadness in works of art, it might explain the power of tragedy. In tragedy, you go to the depths, but you find a kind of rescue there. So only if you go to those depths, however, will you be rescued. Enjoying sadness for its own sake and just sentimental pretense at grief is not going to help. But actually going to the full encounter with human mortality and what it means, as in a real tragedy, maybe that is a help. Maybe that does take us to a point where we can actually learn something that we need to learn it in our hearts and in our emotions, and learn to bear this thing. Perhaps that is why we want to go to tragedies again and again. So art is certainly not going to be any help to us if it loses sight of what we are and what we need. And we do recognize that there is a distinction between true and false emotion. What false emotion comes about when the I eclipses the you. Most love, most real love, is about you, the other. But sentimental love pretends to be about you, but it's really about me feeling this wonderful thing and showing thereby my moral distinction. And we find that kind of sentimentality in art, and also we find art which challenges that sentimentality. Thomas Kinkade is all about me being a lovely person, whereas Van Gogh is all about you, the you that appears to him through, even in a field of wheat, because of course that's God who's appearing to him. So as I'm going back to what I said about Henry James, real art doesn't judge, it opens the world to judgment. And let me go back. And inspires that judgment in us. And I wanted to finish with some difficult examples. In the Brothers Karamazov, another book that you might be on the verge of reading, or on the verge of not bothering to read, Dostoevsky doesn't judge. He invites us to judge in his stead. But what he's inviting us to judge is a whole community of people who don't judge, but just do in the most horrifying way. And this is a very challenging book, therefore. Dickens, in Old Curiosity Shop, The Death of Little Nell, lays it on with a trowel, trying to make us weep over the death of this innocent little girl who's forgiving everybody for dying before her time. And it's not only unrealistic and implausible, but real schmaltz. And Oscar Wilde famously said about this that a man must have a heart of stone not to laugh at the death of little Nell, which is a brilliant way of summarizing it. In the Salome case, though, this is a realization in imagined form of a grim state of mind, a really horrible state of mind, but realized without any negative judgment. That's the great problem, that this is music of sublime power, which simply happens to have been applied to this horrible situation. Strauss was able to do that. He once said that if you gave me a railway timetable, I'd set it to the most beautiful music. So is this a fault? Well, again, just to conclude, to get you to compare two portrayals of the crucifixion. Grunewald, the famous Eisenheim altarpiece in Germany, gives a hyper-realistic portrayal under the horror of the crucifixion, such that nobody can say that he's denying the reality of this, or that he's turning away or falsifying. There's no falsification, but somehow it leaves you without hope. It's as though it really is just that, the death and destruction of a person. Whereas in Tintoretto's case, much harder to... Oh, it's not too bad on the screen. There you see the most extraordinary sequence of events in which actually the redemption of not just the resurrection of Christ, but the redemption of mankind is foretold in every detail of the painting. And this, therefore, is not a horrifying painting at all, but actually a consoling one, and one in which you see just why it is that Christ had to be sacrificed. From Grunewald, you don't know why it is. It's just yet another inexplicable and horrifying accident of human degenerate life. So, anyway, those are two examples that you might take away to think about. And I think I've gone on for long enough now. I can invite some questions. So, thank you.